Welcome to the Art of Journey. Thank you for coming. All right. Cool. So have any of you guys played Journey? Yeah? Right on. That's cool. All right. So I'm Matt Nava. I was the art director on this game. I joined That Game Company on Flower, and this game I was on from the very beginning. So really fun experience. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of ideas behind the character, creatures, landscapes, architecture, and the sequences in the game, and how we got to the final look. So this is the character, as you know him, or her, or it, and you might be surprised to know that one of the earliest drawings I did of this character actually looked like this. Very different. This drawing, at the very beginning of the project, Genova and I talked about this idea of characters that could communicate without language. And so one of our first ideas was to have them communicate with their eyes only. So I drew this character with big eyes, and that didn't work out. So we moved on, and we had this idea of cloth in the world. So I drew a lot of drawings of these characters who had cloth all over them, and I really wanted the character to be dynamic and jump around, so I drew them jumping around and generally waving that cloth around. So this is kind of, in the very early stages, I did this color piece to kind of get a mood feeling of the game, and this is one of the cloth-clad characters. And in the foreground, you see this kind of giant snake idea. So the floating snakes that you see in the game were kind of an idea from the very beginning. But the style kept changing, and one day I drew this drawing, which I think really set the tone of the game. This was done in the first couple weeks of development and really kind of helped the team get a sense for the mood of the game we wanted to make. And the character on the left, the mask that he's wearing is kind of very similar to the final mask that we ended up going with. So we took this character. This is one of the first characters that we built in 3D and animated for the game, and you could actually run around in the game as this guy. He had like 25 animations or something, so he could fly around and jump around and do all sorts of silly stuff. We also did a 2D prototype. So I did these guys, and they're super fun. Yeah, it used to be that you could change your color in the beginning of the game because we thought that people needed to be able to tell each other apart via color. But that idea changed. So when we first pitched this idea of this game to Sony, we made an animated trailer, and it had this character, and I'm going to play that for you. So this is a very early version of how the game might have turned out. See if this works.
Thank you.
So you might notice that that music that was in that trailer is actually the exact same music that is in the first trailer that we actually announced the game with. Austin Wintory, the composer, he came up with the theme like on the first day. It was kind of crazy. Guy's amazing. So that trailer really helped us get the game started in terms of its design. And from there, I wanted the character, I wanted to iterate on the character and make it better. And one thing I tried to do was add more detail, and it got more and more complex. And this character took a really long time to make. He actually had completely animated fingers and everything, and it was really crazy. He was in the game for 1 day, and then the programmers were like, this is way too hard to make actually work, so forget it. I actually had this drawing and this character that I made. I was like, oh my God, what if we put like 100 arms on him? And they were just like, no. So I kind of had to go back to the drawing board, and I started thinking about flower, and that game had basically like flower petals. That was what you played as. I was like, how do I make the character for the next That Game Company game? And it has to be more simple. So actually the next design was this version. And this is where I started to think about removing anything that really wasn't necessary for the gameplay. Gameplay at that point wasn't about climbing or anything with arms, so I took the arms off. It's all about walking. So he's got little feet. And eventually we took the feet off too. And then I was like, well, what if we took off even more? So I took off the feet, as you can see on that drawing down there. And I took off the head, and then it was just a kite. And I was like, well, maybe that's a little too much. But that kite character actually did end up appearing in the game. You see them in the desert, these kind of flying, we call them the fish, but they were basically like these kind of cloth kites. So this kind of experimentation in removing even more actually was the kind of where that idea for those characters came. So, but eventually we realized we need to have this character use completely simulated cloth, because the previous characters were all joint-driven animation, and it was just like this looping, waving animation on the cloth that looked really stiff. So these drawings were done to kind of create an idea for how the character might go together with a dynamic piece of cloth. And that's kind of the progression until how we got to our final guy. And here you can see him in his different states, painting all these different textures for when he's glowing, or when he's white, or when he's freezing. And so here are kind of all the characters that were at one time playable in the game, I think, except for that second to last one. He was never in the game. But, and that's kind of how the progression went. You can see how it got more and more complex, and then it went back to this more simplified, iconic idea that we ended up going with. So the next part I'm going to talk about is the creatures that you see in the game. And this is actually from one of the tapestries that you see in one of the ancestor visions of one of these creatures. This was actually the very first drawing I did of what eventually became the kind of bad guys in Journey. This was one of the very first drawings I did for Journey at all. It was the very first drawing that had the concept of the slit of light that you walk into at the end of the game. You can see on the far side that there's like this white vertical line. It's kind of confusing, but that's what it is. And the idea is that these floating, scary things are kind of hunting you, and there's like this idea of stealth gameplay. So yeah, the first ideas I had for these were these kind of organic sandworms. That's kind of cliche. For a long time, we had this guy in the game. He was just kind of flying around in the sky, and I put these little funny eyeballs on him. And we eventually figured out that if we wanted to make this interact with the player in the way that they do in the game, we wouldn't be able to easily animate a character that was organic like this. So we actually decided to go with a segmented character because of that. So I started thinking about what if they were kind of more like these robotic sculptural creatures. And this is one of the very first versions we had of what we called the Guardians, but they're also kind of like the stone dragons, snakes that chase you. So we also tried creating this character out of cloth, and what we found was that the cloth it didn't feel scary. It felt good. So we actually decided to make another character in the game that you run into. This guy, who uses the exact same technology as the ones that are frightening. And you ride on him, and he's super fun. So that technology got reused for that, obviously. But one thing that was probably the most difficult thing to design for these bad guys was the face. I wanted to have this very scary and memorable face to the bad guy. And it took me a long time to come up with this. And the way that I came up with it was actually by doing this drawing here, which is kind of like, my idea was, well, what if your character you control was actually, was this dark side? So I did this Cyclops kind of version, and that was really what guided me to the actual design that we went with for the bad guys. And so here you can see kind of how they ended up. And they have two kind of states in the game where you see them as a sculptural form, and then they turn alive, chase you. And we had to make sure that they could do all of those things. So it was quite a challenging thing to design. Okay, so the landscapes of the game. This is actually a painting I did. I started this painting on Nintendo DS with Colors app. Anybody use that? No? It's really good. It's still my favorite mobile painting app. Anyway, so the way we approached the landscapes in Journey was with this kind of color guide, where the left side represents the beginning of the game, and the right side represents the end. And on the top, you can see this kind of very basic idea of how the colors progress, and then it becomes more and more complex as you look further down this diagram. And we actually stuck pretty close to these color diagrams. We added a couple more sections later on, but you can really see how that affects the game in this early concept art that I did. It's basically a cross-section of the Journey world and the colors that you would see there. So this is a really early landscape painting I did. We were just at this time implementing the cloth technology, and I wanted to figure out a way that we could have cloth in this landscape. Eventually, this idea of these wooden flag posts, essentially, became the kind of stone gravestones you see everywhere in the game. And I was doing, on the early part of the project, I was doing a lot of paintings. This is probably a little bit too dark to see here, but I was doing these paintings, and I was told to try to make these work in 3D. And so I tried to recreate this painting in 3D, and I kind of failed miserably. And I really learned that we had to approach the graphics completely differently. Couldn't use like regular kind of Lambert shaders and things for these objects. We needed to really think about the 3D in a different way and think about how we can make it more like an illustration and less like a 3D graphic. And so this idea of this kind of cavern eventually turned into this area of the game that's really frightening, and you can see that the way that it looks is much more atmospheric than the original designs. So yeah, we did a lot of things where we would take screenshots of the game as it was, and I would paint over them. This is actually a paint over of a screenshot of one of the first areas in the game, where I added these towers and these rocks and all sorts of things. And then we tried to modify the game to actually look like that, and this is how it turned out. You guys probably remember this part. This level was pretty interesting. We wanted this sense of openness and happiness in the desert level, where players kind of, at this point in the game, know how to play the game and are meeting other people and are having a lot of fun. And one thing that we did visually was we let the player see further. We push the fog back, and it's more clear. That kind of represents, in Journey across the game, if it's clearer, then it's kind of a place where you're supposed to feel more happy, and if it's more dim and the fog is closer, it becomes less happy and more scary. And I went for the sky being green because I actually wanted to save the color blue for the last part of the game. I wanted that blue color to become a reward for players, kind of like a breath of fresh air. You never see any blue sky until that last area. So I was like, well, if I can't do blue, I'm just going to do green, I guess. So that's how that kind of worked out. This is a 3D prototype I did of that area. And then this is kind of how it ended up in the game. So here's another early 3D prototype I did for one of the early levels we had. We were going to have a level called the Canyon where players would run around in a steep canyon. But it eventually turned into this area in the game. Quite a transformation. The idea of the character sliding came in later, and we needed to have a cool level where you could slide around. So we changed the canyon level to be the sliding level. One interesting thing was the evolution of the mountain itself. The iconic mountain that you're traveling towards in the game was originally a cliff, not a mountain at all. And in the very early days of the project, I was exploring this idea of having a very highly textured, painterly kind of watercolor look to the game. We eventually realized that would be really hard to do well. So I later had an idea, well, what if we removed all texture? So I did this 3D mock-up of the mountain. You can see it's getting taller now, where I tried to emphasize flat shapes and actually make the 3D space look as flat as I could. Give it more of an illustration look. And eventually, when we finished the game, a little bit of that texture started to creep back in, and it became kind of this blend between my ideas about making this kind of flat 3D and also this idea of bringing in textural elements. So I'll talk a little bit about the architecture. So this is one of the largest buildings in Journey that you climb, one of the early models. Started from this drawing. Everything in Journey started from about 1 million drawings. I spent like a week straight scanning drawings to make the Art of Journey book. This is how it turned out in the game. You had a lot of atmosphere and stuff you can actually see. So I guess there's sandstorm around the building and stuff. But this is not how the buildings looked originally. Originally, I was doing a lot of studies of existing architecture from Greek and Roman design. I was really fascinated by this idea of a canon of architecture, of kind of a rule set that dictated how the buildings were designed back then. Everybody used the same proportions, the system, to make things look good. So I took that idea and I made my own kind of structures with it, and then tried to incorporate the idea of Journey cloth into it. And eventually I decided I really needed to make my own canon of architecture for this game, which was super fun. And this is another Nintendo DS drawing. But it's very interesting because you can see that I started to think about these arches. And the arches in Journey are kind of memorable because they have this stair-step design. Here you can see an arch that has like half stair-step and half round arch. So it's kind of like when that idea formed. And here's a final building and a mock-up building, and you can see kind of how they transitioned in terms of architecture style. So this is one area where the player is surfing and he flies out of a waterfall, and this is really cool because I got to really integrate the landscape with the architecture, and this drawing actually ended up being almost exactly how it turned out in the game, which is kind of rare to kind of nail it right on the spot like that. It's pretty cool. We also had a level that was basically this underground cavern, which I wanted to be completely architectural, and it was a very difficult task to figure out how to implement that. And this was one early version of it. I did this painting of this tower. This is an underdrawing, and then we have the painting I did. And this is one of the final levels where you're climbing this tower, and this painting is blue, right? It's like, it used to actually be the same level as the previous level, which is very blue. So in the very end, I decided I need to change level color. So it actually ended up like this in the game. I swapped it to be orange, and it kind of really was a good choice, I think, because that gave it more of a holy feel. It became like this temple. And it kind of worked with the music and everything like that. The final area of Journey had this bridge. I wanted to have this very scary bridge. So I did this painting of it. And then this is kind of how it turned out in the game. This is one of like the most punishing moments in Journey if you fall off this thing, because you have to walk all the way back around. It's like really bad. And you used to be able to fall off of these buildings, which would have been so punishing. So we decided to change that. But there you can see some of the preliminary drawings I did for the very final architecture you see in the snow level, which contrasts heavily with the architecture you see in the very final level, which is very spare. You don't see a lot of it. But I took inspiration from the Japanese torii gate, which is kind of in the Shinto religion. It represents kind of where the sacred space is delineated from profane space. And I wanted to have this final level have this very dreamlike quality where you would feel like you were in a very magical and spiritual zone. So I put this kind of architecture in there to kind of reinforce that idea. All right, so the last part I'm going to talk about is sequences. So in Journey, I did a lot of storyboard drawings. So this is storyboard drawing for the part where you kind of wake up and you blast off into the clouds. We did a lot of storyboards for the gameplay. We also did a lot of storyboards for the ancestors. We call them the ancestors, that you see at each level. And the game didn't actually always have these characters. We put them in because players didn't really know when the level ended and without them, and they didn't really have a sense of completion without some sort of storytelling at the end of each level, some sort of feeling that they understand the space a little bit more. So my first idea, this is one of the very early ideas for how this character would appear. He would kind of materialize in the air. And it was really, really weird. So I have this kind of old footage of the game. You can kind of hear Genova snickering about it, I think. So basically, this is one of the early versions of these ancestor interactions. You see two guys kind of like overlapping because there's no code at that point to tell them to not sit right on top of each other. And what he does is he just kind of comes out and then he flies away. And it's really awkward, and you can kind of see up his skirt, and it's like, and then he just like disappears. It's like, oh great, okay, what was that about? So we had to change that. They just didn't seem meaningful at all. And you can see that the game was really ugly back then. So I was like, okay, well, how can they leave in a way that is not so weird? So my next idea was like, okay, so I did this painting. I was like, well, what if they like just totally explode and like that, you know? It's like, well, no, that's not really good either. So I kind of put that problem off, and I started to think about what they were going to say. And so we wanted to communicate without language. So I started doing these designs for these kind of hieroglyphs that they would show you the kind of history of the world with. And I instantly was told, this is too high resolution. We can't do that many images. So try a 128 by 64 texture, okay? And so we tried to do that. So these images eventually became scattered throughout the world, and you see little secrets. And I also created this really long image that kind of goes from left to right. You kind of uncover throughout the game. You can see some details of it here. And it kind of tells you the backstory of the game. So the ancestors had something meaningful to present. And the final thing that we figured out with the ancestor was they just can't be in the same world as you. So the player actually enters this kind of trance or vision, and they see the ancestor, and then when they wake up, the ancestor disappears. So then that way you didn't have to fly away or explode or anything. It was just kind of worked a lot better. So that was good. Very ending of the game, I had this storyboard for this guy who kind of like walks and touches this light, and there's like one frame where you can kind of see his hand like touching the light, and it's like the TGC logo, and I thought that was really cool. And but eventually what we found was that the players really didn't want a cutscene at the end. They wanted to be able to control the character all the way to the end. And so we actually removed the entire sequence, and it became much more meaningful for players. So that's kind of how the ending turned out. So yeah, that's kind of my talk. We started with a lot of drawings like this, and then we did a lot of prototypes like this. And after a lot of iteration, we finally kind of came to the final art of Journey. So thank you very much. Thank you. So if you have any questions or anything. Also, there's an art book that I made about the book, and it has a lot more pictures if you're interested. And also, I just started a company, so if you're an engineer, you want a job, come talk to me. But yeah, if you want to ask questions, we have time for questions, I think. Okay, so I'll be out in the hallway if you have any questions. Thank you.